the second half of the first day of the inaugural conference for our project. And very pleased to have Snow here, who's a first soft fellow at NYU, I believe, at the moment. And Snow, I actually don't know if I remember the title of your talk, but it is about aggregation. I do remember that, which thrills me. So Snow's going to tell us about aggregation in the IP context. Take it away, Snow.
Thank you very much. Yeah, actually, I just emailed you my title yesterday, so it's completely understandable that you don't know it. And let me just share my screen so that somehow I'm not seeing the sharing. Let me try to, sorry, wait a minute. Also, let me just replace the link to the slides in the chat today for those who just joined. So you can also get the slides from the Google Drive link. Oh, here, okay. Great, okay. Sorry, I'm going to do the slides with the gray bar because I don't know how to remove them. And the title of my slide, my talk is Pooling and Updating on Experts' Opinions with Imprecise Probabilities. Let me begin by thanking Jason, Arthur, and Kevin for organizing such a great conference. I'm so sad that I'm not able to be there in person. I should also say that I'm very new to imprecise probabilities. They're so hard, so I try to avoid thinking about them for the last 5 years, but they're also so fascinating. This is just to say that although I think I have some new results in this talk, I would also not be surprised that they are already known in the literature, and I would be happy to be educated. Okay, so let's move on. Let me start with stating the problem. So in August 2020, Joseph Biden was asked in an interview whether he would shut the country down to stop the spread of COVID-19 if the move was recommended to him by the scientists. And for those of you who know roughly Joseph Biden's political philosophy, you might have anticipated his answer. He said, I would shut it down. I would listen to the scientists. Okay, so you might already have a question in your mind whether or not that's the rational thing to do. But setting that aside, the question also presupposed this simplifying assumption that the scientists had reached an unanimous consensus that it would help to stop the spread of the COVID-19 by shutting the country down. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. For those of you who have been following the news, different variants of COVID, and also in particular, the necessity of a booster shot, you might know that the scientists are hugely divided on the question whether or not a booster shot is necessary. In particular, recently, a bunch of international scientists published an article arguing that a booster shot is not necessary for preventing COVID-19. And on the other hand, and this is very interesting, though I haven't been able to track down the source of this claim. So according to some news agency, the FDA response is that the view of the authors do not represent the view of the agency. Okay, so I think this is a nice case illustrating sort of the importance of the two questions that I'm going to consider for the rest of this talk. The first one, which you might be asking once you see the FDA responses, then what is the view of FDA? They say that the view does not represent the view of the agency, then what is the view of the agency? And secondly, you might be wondering, well, given that the scientists are so hugely divided on the question whether or not a booster shot is necessary, how confident should we as non-experts, be that booster shots are necessary in light of their different opinions? So those are the two questions you might ask in this context, and more generally, I'm interested in the following two questions. Given multiple experts' individual opinions, first, you might ask, what is their collective opinion as a group? What is the opinion of FDA? And secondly, you might wonder, well, how should a rational non-expert revise their own opinion about the subject matter given the multiple experts' individual opinions? So one is a question of pooling, and the other one is a question of updating. So just to put the questions in more precise forms, and I should also say that for the first half of the talk, I'm actually going to work with a simplifying assumption that probabilities are supposed to be precise, though the goal is to move in the second half of the talk, I'm going to motivate the claim that actually probabilities in order to solve these two questions, we should move to the imprecise framework. But let's first start with the simplifying assumptions that we should assign precise probabilities to propositions. So first, let's just fix a finite sigma of propositions, also known as the agenda. And let delta F denote the set of precise real-valued probability distributions over this agenda. And then delta NF would denote the set of sequences, n sequences of probability distributions over this agenda, which are also known as the profiles. So the thought is each PI represents the opinion of group member I. And lastly, a pooling function would just be represented by a function from a profile, the set of profiles, to a precise probability function over the agenda. So that's the framework. And as I said, we're going to first adopt the idealizing assumption that the experts and non-experts both have precise real-valued credences in propositions in the agenda. Then we can make the two questions more precise in the following way. The pooling question then asks, what is the correct F? How should we pool different probability distributions into one single probability distribution? And the problem of updating then is a question, what are the rational constraints, if any, on the conditional probability of P, given that P1 to Pn is the credence functions of expert I to N, assuming that P is the rational credence function of a non-expert. So those are the more precise statements of the two questions. And as you can see, these are not the same question, as many have warned us. We should not treat them as the same question. And yet, on the other hand, I also think that these two questions are intimately related to each other, which justifies why I want to treat them in the same way for the rest of this talk. So in particular, I think they are related in the following three aspects. First, just to give you sort of a motivating statement. So here's Winkler in his classic 1968 paper. He was trying to solve the problem of aggregation, but he motivates his project on the basis of solving the problem of updating. He thought, well, here's the situation. A decision maker might have very little knowledge about the parameters. For example, the likelihood that the booster shot would prevent the spread of COVID-19. And in this case, he may decide to consult someone who does have such knowledge, preferably someone who is considered reasonably expert with regard to the parameters. And the problem to be considered for him then is a combination of a number of distributions into one single distribution that can be used as an input to a formal Bayesian analysis. So he was thinking, I want to solve the problem of aggregation in order to solve the problem of updating. So that seems to be the logic. And more generally, some people have thought that, well, the right answer to the problem of aggregation is indeed given by the right answer to the problem of updating in the following sense. The aggregate probability of a group just is the probability of a supra-Bayesian conditional on the opinions of the group members. And here's a more formal way of stating that view. The thought is, well, what is F? F is just given by the conditional probability of P given that the experts adopt so-and-so opinions where P is a suitable supra-Bayesian. So according to supra-Bayesianism, the conditional probability defines the pooling operator F. But you might also think that it's actually the other way around. For example, you might be attracted to some principle like group deference, according to which in some contexts, rational experts, non-experts, should defer to the expert's aggregate opinion as a group. So you might think the equation holds not because the conditional probability constrains the pooling operator, but rather the pooling operator, the correct pooling operator that you identify on independent grounds, should in turn impose a rational constraints on the credences of non-experts. So that's another way in which the two problems might connect to each other. And thirdly, in the context of disagreement resolution, you might think, well, how should rational non-experts update their opinions on the basis of multiple experts' individual opinions? Well, they should defer to the experts' post-resolution consensus. And what is their post-resolution consensus? Well, that is the rational opinion they should adopt after consulting each other's opinion. And the background assumption is that there should be one unique opinion they should adopt after exchanging opinions with each other. So the formal pooling rule would then constrain the experts' credences after exchanging opinions with each other, and then indirectly constrain the rational credence of the non-expert. So anyway, I think, as I said, there are two problems. One is a problem of aggregation or pooling, and the other one is a problem of updating. So there are two different problems. We should keep that in mind. But on the other hand, I also think that they are intimately related in at least these three respects. So they actually won't be very much relevant to the formal results that I'm going to discuss, but it might be relevant to the philosophical upshots we could draw from the formal results that I'm going to discuss later. Okay, so that's the problem. And they might seem simple at first glance, but unfortunately they're not. For those of you who are roughly familiar with the literature, you might know that this literature is filled with impossibility results. Basically results of the kind that show that certain intuitively plausible principles that would serve as answers to these problems turn out to be jointly incompatible with each other. So that's what I'm going to discuss later. In particular, here's a naive thought. In particular, with respect to the problem of pooling, you might have thought, well, how should you pool different people's credences into one single quantity that could be representative of the aggregate opinion of the group? Well, you might think, in the background, there should be some function, a formal function, such that for every single proposition in the agenda, all you need to do is to get the individual group members' opinion in that proposition, feed that into the function, and then you would be able to get the group's opinion in that proposition. So that is the property of systematicity, which says that, well, for the correct pooling operator, there always exists such a function. And more conceptually speaking, you can basically decompose systematicity into the following two claims. One is irrelevant alternatives, which basically says that how you want to pool the different group members' credences in a proposition doesn't depend on what credences they assign to other propositions in the agenda. And another principle is zero preservation, which says that if all the group members assign credence 0 to some proposition, then the group as a whole also assigns credence 0 to that proposition. So it turns out that McConway proved in his classic paper, 81 paper, that actually these two principles are necessary and sufficient for systematicity. They're equivalent to each other. And a more surprising result is that he proves that systematicity is also necessary and sufficient for linear averaging. Namely, a pooling operator satisfies systematicity if and only if it tells you that the aggregate opinion of the group is just some linear average of the opinions of the group members where the weights are also fixed. So you assign some weight to each individual member. Okay, your opinion weighs this much, your opinion weighs this much, and then you collect their opinions, and that gives you the linear average, gives you the weight, the group opinion as a whole. Okay, so in his original paper, McConway thought this could give you a prima facie justification for linear averaging, given that systematicity, in particular irrelevant alternatives, and zero preservation both seem intuitively plausible. But as many have observed, that there's actually a problem here, because you might think one natural constraint on the pooling operator that you want to impose is that it should also commute with Bayesian conditionalization, meaning that for every proposition in the agenda, it shouldn't matter whether or not you pool the expert's opinion first and then update the group's opinion on this proposition, or you ask each individual expert to update on this proposition first and then pool their posteriors according to the operator. In a slogan, pooling and learning should commute with each other. And a more philosophical defense of this principle is that if you think the group should always choose in accord with the aggregate opinion recommended by the pooling operator, and the pooling operator fails to commute with conditionalization, then you can show that the group is Dutch bootable. And you might think that would be bad for the group as a whole. However, it's very easy to show that linear averaging in general just doesn't commute with Bayesian conditionalization unless it is the rule of dictatorship. It assigns weight 1 to one single probability function, to one group member's credence function. So in other words, a straightforward corollary of our previous result is that there is no non-dictatorial rule that is both systematic and commutes with Bayesian conditionalization. Okay, so that's the main impossibility result that I'm going to discuss today. And now, before moving on, let me just make a quick remark. Although before we were talking about pooling operators, we're really working in the context of solving the problem of pooling. You might think all three principles, irrelevant alternatives, zero preservation, and commutativity with Bayesian conditionalization, are all plausible in the context of updating as well, or at least under some appropriate assumptions. So just to give you a precise statement of the three principles in the context of updating, one says that, well, how should a non-expert update on the opinions of the experts? You might think, wow, how she should update doesn't depend on what the experts think about the other propositions. They only need to be sensitive to the expert's opinion in one single proposition. And also might think zero preservation is plausible. If all the experts assign credence 0 to some proposition, then the non-expert conditionalizing on their opinions should also assign credence 0 to that proposition. You might think that was the principle driving Biden's reasoning. He was like, I would follow the scientists. If the scientists all agree that this is what we're going to do, then that's what I'm going to do. And lastly, you might think commutativity should also hold for this rational non-expert. And here is just an analog of the three principles in the context of disagreement resolution, which I won't go through here, but basically a straightforward corollary of the previous result is that in judgment aggregation, sorry, I think I missed a slide, but never mind. So basically you can derive a similar impossibility result for updating, and also a special upshot of the previous discussion is that in disagreement resolution, irrelevant alternatives and zero preservation entails linear averaging, which means that linear averaging or equivalently irrelevant alternatives and zero preservation, together with commutativity and self-respect, which is the view that you should assign some weight to your own view, entails the principle of being steadfast in responding to disagreement. The thought is, well, if you think that the way that you resolve disagreement should satisfy all these assumptions, then you should always stick to your own opinion, irrespective of the dissenting voice of your peers. Okay, so before moving on to the imprecise framework, let me actually just strengthen this impossibility result a little bit, because I think here's one natural thought. You might think what transpires is that there's a limitation in our original framework. In particular, you might think the correct way of pooling a group of experts' opinions should depend on what evidence each expert has. So recall that before we defined a pooling operator as just a function from the set of profiles to a precise probability function. The thought is, well, all you need to know is the group's individual members' credence function, and then you can get the credence function of the entire group. But you might think, actually, we should relativize this pooling function to the experts' evidential profiles. And here I'm just going to adopt the simple model of evidential profile, namely assuming that each expert has some total evidence represented by a proposition, and then an evidence profile would just be a sequence of propositions, EI representing the total evidence of expert I. In particular, if the experts have the same evidence, then the pooling rule can just be modeled by a slightly more complicated object, which maps a proposition to a pooling rule of our previous sense, a pooling rule that maps a probability profile to a single precise real-valued probability function. And it's easy to generalize the notion of systematicity to this context. We can just say a pooling rule of the previous sense. The more complicated thing is systematic, just in case each FE is systematic for all proposition E. And the payoff of this more complicated setup, you might think, is that it will give us a weaker version of commutativity, which seems more plausible. So recall that previously we stated the constraint of commutativity as the principle that pooling should commute with updating. Importantly, the pooling rule that we're using before and after updating are the same. But you might think once we relativize the pooling rule to the evidential profiles of the experts, then that allows us to use different pooling rules before and after updating. The thought is, well, before the experts learn evidence E prime, you would use FE, where E represents their total common evidence, and pull their credences according to FE, and then update that credence function by E prime. And that should be the same as asking the experts to update on E prime first, and then pull their opinions, not using FE, but rather FE and E prime. In particular, in this framework, you could allow FE to be different from FE and E prime. So I think the naive thought would be, well, once we relativize the pooling rules in this way, we might be able to get around the impossibility result. At least that was my naive thought. But unfortunately, it turns out that we can prove a collapse result in this context. So it turns out that if F is systematic and commutes with Bayesian intentionalization, then for any non-trivial E and E prime, basically they're compatible with at least two possible words. Then you can show that relativizing to the evidential profiles does not help. They must be all the same. So that means that even if we relativize the pooling rule with respect to the evidential profiles, we still get back the impossibility result. Namely, there's no non-dictatorial systematic rule that commutes with Bayesian intentionalization. So I think this shows that the impossibility result is really robust in this particular sense. Okay, so that's the situations we're in. We have a bunch of attractive principles, but unfortunately, they are jointly incompatible with each other. And basically, the options on the table is just dropping one principle or the other. And in particular, you might think, well, we should drop systematicity, in particular, the principle of irrelevant alternatives, how the way in which we determine the opinion of a group in a proposition should depend on what each individual member thinks about other propositions. Or you might think, well, recall the principle of commutativity, which says that pooling should commute with learning. And you might think the right way of learning may not always be Bayesian intentionalization. In this particular context, probably the group should update in accord with a procedure that is not Bayesian intentionalization. Lastly, you might think we should just drop the demand of commutativity altogether for some reason that has to do with the goal of updating. So updating or aggregating, the thought is, well, we use aggregation function for one purposes and use it for different purposes. For some of those purposes, the result group credence we get does not have to commute with updating. So actually, I want to discuss all these three options on the table here. I think they're all interesting, and it will be a much longer discussion than I have time for. So instead, because this is a conference on imprecise probability, so I will focus on a fourth proposal proposed by Stewart and Quintana in a recent paper. So they suggest that actually we can keep all three principles that we like, and instead the impossibility result reveals that actually we should reject the initial assumption we made at the beginning, namely that the output of a pooling operator should always be a precise probability function. Remember, that was an assumption we made at the very outset, and their response is, well, probably that is the real culprit for the impossibility result. Sometimes when we try to represent the opinion of a group, maybe the best representation of the opinion of the group should be given by an imprecise probability function or a set of probabilities as opposed to one single precise probability function. So more precisely, just to recapitulate, so recall that we define f as mapping a profile to a precise probability function. And the proposal is basically to say that no, f could map a profile to a set of probability functions. And we say f is precise when its output has cardinality 1 and imprecise otherwise. So in this more general framework, that gives an alternative restatement of the previous impossibility result as an argument for imprecision. So basically, what we have shown before is that f is systematic, non-dictatorial, and commutes with Bayesian constraintualization only if f is imprecise. There are no precise pooling rules that satisfy all three properties. Okay, so now finally, let's move on to imprecise pooling rules. So a natural question you might ask once we move to this more general framework is, well, okay, so now we have more options, but which option is correct? So in their paper, Stewart and Quintana proposes one particular imprecise pooling rule, which they called convex imprecise probability. So basically the thought is, well, what is the opinion of the group? The opinion of the group is just the convex whole of the opinions of these individual members. And it's very easy to, well, it's not very easy, but relatively easy to check that convex imprecise probability satisfies all the three properties that we learned before: systematicity, non-dictatorship, and commutativity with Bayesian constraintualization. So we do have a tunability result for this particular pooling rule. I should say that perhaps one thing that you might have in your mind right now is whether or not we sort of land ourselves to some kind of triviality results when we move to the imprecise context. So I'm going to address that worry towards the end of the talk, but hold on to that thought for the time being. Okay, in fact, we actually get a stronger tunability result for imprecise probability because it turns out that CIP, convex imprecise probability pooling, satisfies the following stronger property known as external Bayesianity. So basically, you can think of external Bayesianity as giving you as a generalized version of commutativity with Bayesian constraintualization. I won't go through the formal details here. One way of thinking about external Bayesianity, as pointed out by Wagner, is that you can think of a pooling rule as being externally Bayesian, just in case it commutes with Jeffrey constraintualization, where Jeffrey constraintualization learning experiences are identified with the odds ratio of the old and new probabilities over the partition element. So in the slogan form, you can think of external Bayesianity as a generalization of commutativity with Bayesian constraintualization in precisely the way that Jeffrey constraintualization is a generalization of Bayesian constraintualization. Okay, so that is good news. We do have a pooling rule when we move to this imprecise context that satisfies all the principles that we like. But the natural question to ask at this point, I think, is whether or not that is the only only pooling rule, sorry for the mistake on the slides, whether or not that is the only pooling rule that satisfies all the constraints that we like. And a moment of reflection will suggest that the answer must be no, because consider, for example, the following pooling rule, which I call the rule of amalgamation. Basically, it just says that the credence of the group is just given by the set of credences held by the individual members. It's very easy to check that this rule would also satisfy the properties listed above. Well, as some of you have mentioned, actually the speakers have mentioned before in previous two talks, one objection you might raise against this rule is that the output of the pooling operator is not convex. And you might think, well, when we are trying to give a representation of the opinion of the group, then even though it can be a set of probability functions, it has to be a set satisfying certain properties. In particular, it has to be a convex set of probability distributions. But of course, as discussed in previous talks, the notion, the constraint of convexity is very controversial. I don't have anything to say, interesting to say about this. So I'll just flag that this is one way in which you can reject the rule of amalgamation. Actually, that is the only way I know of rejecting the rule of amalgamation in the imprecise context. But even if we impose the assumption of convexity, still it's easy to find alternative pooling rules that also satisfy the previous constraints we mentioned. For example, suppose that we have more than 3 experts, and then consider the pooling rule that says that, well, I actually don't care about any experts after the first 2, so I give them labels 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so on and so forth. And whenever I pool the experts' credence functions, I only care about the first 2. So in a sense, this is not quite dictatorship as we defined before, but it's kind of oligarchy. And it's easy to check that this rule also satisfies the 3 principles that we mentioned before. So we don't get, so convex imprecise probability pooling is not the only rule that satisfies the 3 properties. Well, as we said, the convex, the rule that tells us let's only focus on the first 2 experts. That rule, although it is not dictatorship, is oligarchy. And it seems irrational or rather defective in some other way. In particular, it violates the following constraint proposed by Russell et al. So they call this constraint anonymity, which basically says that when you pool together different experts' opinions into one single quantity, be it a set of probability distributions or one single probability distribution, it shouldn't matter who holds which probability function. All you care is the probability functions themselves, but it shouldn't matter that it's agent I as opposed to agent J who is holding the probability function. So that's the thought. The identity of the group member doesn't matter, and that is the constraint of anonymity. It is easy to check that the previous rule, oligarchy rule that we mentioned before, that rule doesn't satisfy anonymity, and yet on the other hand, convex imprecise probability pooling rule does satisfy anonymity. And indeed, and here's the main result of this talk. So under certain structural assumptions, we can show that general systematicity, external Bayesianity, and anonymity together are necessary and sufficient for pinning down convex imprecise probability rule as the only updating in the imprecise framework. And just to give you, I won't go through them in detail here, just to give you the statement of the structural assumptions and general systematicity for the sake of interest. So actually, I haven't checked in detail, but I actually think that some of the, especially the second structural assumption may be able to be relaxed, and this result may still go through. Basically, the first one, as we said before, is the assumption that the output of the pooling rule must be closed and convex. And the second one basically says that the size of the group is smaller than the set of the agenda. You have more things to discuss than you have people here in the group. So those are the 2 structural assumptions. And general systematicity basically says that, well, before we said, how should we determine the probability that a group assigns to a particular proposition in an agenda? Well, all we need to do is to feed the probabilities that the individual members assign to this proposition to some formal functions, and then we'll get the probability that this group assign to this proposition as a whole. General systematicity just says that, well, that generalizes to expectations as well. So in order to determine the expectation that the group assigns to a particular random variable, all you need is to feed the expectation of each individual members assigns to this random variable, and then you will get the expectation that the group assigns to this random variable as a whole. Okay, so that's general systematicity and the 2 structural assumptions, and it turns out that under those 2 structural assumptions, systematicity, external Bayesianity, and anonymity are necessary and sufficient for CIP. Okay, just a quick note. So actually, in the context of updating, before we're talking about the problem of pooling, so in the context of updating, because Bayesian intentionalization is commutative, we actually get anonymity for free. So a straightforward corollary of our previous result is if we make those structural assumptions, and then we require that the P satisfies general systematicity and also it means with Jeffrey contextualization in the sense made precise before, then we get the result that P contextualizing on the opinions of the experts must be the convex whole of the opinions of the experts. Okay, one last technical point. But this could also be raised as an objection to the framework. So far we have been assuming that the experts all have precise probability functions. We relax the assumption that the opinion of the group of experts must be precise without, okay, the opinion of the group as a whole could be representable by an imprecise probability or set of probability functions as opposed to one single probability functions. But we are still holding on to the assumption that the experts each has precise probability functions. And you might wonder, well, what if we relax that assumption? What if the experts' probabilities are themselves imprecise? And I think that is a natural thing to ask, because in particular, you might think when we're doing aggregation, we often do aggregation locally and then globally, in the sense that we sort of have different groups. So we aggregate the opinions of one group and then the other group, and then we might want to aggregate the opinions of all the groups together. So that means that if we allow the opinion of a group to be imprecise, then we will want the inputs of our pooling operator to also include imprecise probabilities as well. So I think that's a natural thing to ask. And I think a natural thought for answering this question is that given anonymity, it's easy to see that each pooling operator can be viewed as a function, not from profiles, but just from sets of probabilities, two sets of probabilities, because the order doesn't matter. All we care is what opinions the group members have rather than who has that opinion. So in that context, I think that suggests, and sorry, there's a typo here, there should be some ... But basically the thought is, well, that suggests the following generalization of convex imprecise probability rule, which basically the thought that, well, suppose the experts all have imprecise probabilities. Then we can just pretend that we're aggregating many more experts' precise probability functions. So we can just put each expert is themselves a group, and we can just think that we just have a humongous group. And all we want to do is to aggregate the humongous group of experts, each of whom has a precise probability function. So that's, I think, a general thought, assuming anonymity. And one problem, technical problem in this case, is that basically before we are assuming that we always have finitely many experts. But if we adopt this perspective, and especially if we also hold on to convexity, which is something we need in order to get our characterization result, then we are dealing with aggregation of infinitely many experts' probabilities, precise probabilities. And the technical problem that I run into here is that before, it turns out that systematicity entails the principle of Pareto, which basically says that the group as a whole doesn't assign a higher expectation to some random variables that is higher than the maps of the expectation of each of its individual members. So in a way, even though we allow the group's opinion to be represented by a set of probabilities, it would always be a subset of the convex whole of the opinions of the individual members. So in the previous case, you can show that general systematicity implies Pareto principle. But actually, I don't know whether or not this is true once we allow the number of the experts to be uncountably infinite. But on the other hand, you might think Pareto is independently plausible, even if we can't get it from general systematicity. You might just want to impose it as an additional constraint on F, on the pooling operators. And in that case, though I stated it as a conjecture, I think I have a proof, though I feel like I also need to sit down and double check my reasoning. But generally, I think it's true that given Pareto, general systematicity, external Bayesianity, and anonymity entails generalized CIP, and also is necessary for that. The thought is generalized CIP, remember, is just a thought that basically says if you have a group of experts, each of whom has imprecise probabilities, then the opinion of the group as a whole would just be a convex whole of all the representers in the probabilities of each individual expert. So that's generalized CIP, and I think general systematicity, external Bayesianity, and anonymity is necessary and sufficient for that rule, assuming Pareto, and also the structural assumptions. Anyway. Okay, so that finishes the technical part of the talk, and let me quickly conclude with a philosophical discussion. So as I said before, that you might have this objection when we move to the imprecise framework, namely whether or not this whole framework lends itself to triviality. In particular, remember the amalgamation function, which just says that the opinion of the group is just given by the set of credence functions held by its individual members. And intuitively, well, indeed, we said before that this rule does satisfy many nice properties. But intuitively, you might think this is not what we wanted when we ask the question how to aggregate the opinions of a group of experts into one single quantity. And similarly, this is not the thing that we wanted when we asked how should a rational non-expert update on different experts' opinions. Somehow this true rule is too trivial to serve as an answer to that question. And I have sort of a two-counter reply to this objection. So my first reply is sort of methodological. So I think even if we concede that objection, I think the imprecise framework still has several methodological virtues. In particular, it can help shed light on the source of various impossibility results. Why do we have those impossibility results? Well, in the imprecise framework, we can hash it out as sufficient conditions for imprecision. Once we have some certain kind of conditions, that serves as sufficient conditions, forcing the F to be imprecise. So that's the first virtue. But more importantly, I think once we move into the imprecise framework, we can then ask some questions that were blind spots previously. So for example, one natural question to ask, and I don't know the answer to this question, is what axiomatic constraints entail precision or imprecision in this framework? And also what kind of axiomatic constraints entail some kind of triviality, for example, the sense of triviality in which, according to which, when we aggregate the opinions of a group of the opinion of the group would always be a superset of the union of the group of the opinions of its individual members. So you might think of it as a triviality result. And one natural question to ask is what kind of constraints would lead us to this triviality result? Well, we've already seen one set of constraints, which is external Bayesianity, systematicity, and anonymity under structural considerations. And lastly, I think the whole framework also brings into sharper focus the target of judgment aggregation and also the nature of the problem of disagreement resolution. And this leads me to the second part of my response, which is also the response discussed by Stewart and Container. So they draw the nice distinction between consensus and compromise. And here's the thought. Basically, you might think here are two things that we're trying to do, two separate things we're trying to do when we do judgment aggregation. The first is to try to identify the common ground amongst the opinions being put or amongst the opinions held by the individual group members and use that as a starting point for subsequent inquiry. So the identification of consensus, that was one goal we might want to achieve with an aggregation function. But here's a different goal, which is to find a compromise that is mutually acceptable among the group members and could be used for the sake of group decision making. So one is to find a common ground, and the other one is to find a compromise point that we may not be comfortable with individually speaking, but may be good enough to serve as a guideline for decision making as a group as a whole. And I think, though I would love to hear your thoughts on this distinction, so I think the axiomatic properties that we discussed before, they're not necessarily appropriate for both problems. In particular, you might think irrelevant alternatives, zero preservation, and anonymity, they're all appropriate if the goal is to find a common ground amongst the individual group members, especially when the experts all have the same evidence. But you might think they're not appropriate for compromise. In particular, you might think, well, for the sake of decision making, I do have to consider the group members' opinions in other propositions in order to decide how I'm going to do, what I'm going to do with respect to certain kind of lotteries or bets regarding the truth of a different proposition. So I think irrelevant alternatives may not be appropriate for finding a compromise, but it may be appropriate for identifying a consensus. So in that sense, the two problems come apart, And you might think the triviality challenge objection doesn't arise if we think of the pooling rule as trying to give us an identification of the common ground shared amongst the individual group members. But at any rate, I think, going back to my previous point, the whole framework just brings into sharper focus the target of judgment and aggregation, and also I think it sheds light on the problem of disagreement resolution. Okay, so that concludes my talk, and let me just quickly summarize the main points. So I've identified two problems, the two problems discussed in the literature. One is the problem of pooling, and one is the problem of updating. I think they're intimately related in various respects, and both problems are hard to solve in light of various impossibility results. Imprecise probability may be a promising way out, and indeed, under certain conditions, is probably the only way out. And how should we react to that result is a question for further investigation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Fantastic talk, Snow. As for those of us joining for just the second half of the day, following the standard procedure of just putting a Q into the chat if you want to ask a question, and I'll keep track of the Q. Seamus and then Jasper.
Cool, thank you. So, okay, yeah. So for the case of pooling sets of probabilities into a set of probabilities, here's an alternative pooling rule. If the intersection of the sets of probabilities is non-empty, take the intersection, and if the intersection is empty, take the convex hull of the unions. So which of the properties that are part of your characterization result of the CIP does that rule violate?
So I have to double check. I know, for example, now discuss the intersection way of doing things. And I think, though I have to double check, as I said, is general systematicity. So in particular, this is something that you can show. For example, here's a trivial pooling rule, which says that whenever the experts agree, so they all have the same probability function, and take that probability function as the group's opinion. But whenever they disagree, then just take all possible probability functions over the agenda. So that would be a pooling rule admissible in the imprecise framework, and that rule violates general systematicity. One way to see that is to think about, well, because we want a formal function in the background that we can always just feed values, and then you give us a precise value, which is supposed to be the expectation of the group's member, the group as a whole, about some random variable. So what value should this function output when it's fed with a sequence of 1? So on the one hand, you might think, well, all the groups, if we think of 1 as representing the group's opinion in the tautology, then that means that it should just output the singleton 1. But for the previous rule, that would not be the case when we think of 1 as the expectation of the group member with respect to some random variable that happens to be 1. So in that case, it would just be the entire interval. So it turns out that that rule, the sort of, you might think of dilation whenever there's disagreement, that rule not satisfy general systematicity. So I feel like the rule that you just proposed, the intersection when there is something, otherwise just dilate to the entire set, I think that might also violate general systematicity.
Thanks. Okay. Jasper next? Yeah.
Hi there. Thank you for a nice start. I have a similar question to Seamus. I have an even more stupid pooling rule, which I'm wondering what properties it doesn't satisfy. If my rule is whatever group of opinions that I get, the resulting pooled opinion is always I know nothing. Always, my response is always consider all possible probability distributions.
Yes.
I wouldn't want to use it, but okay, it's kind of it fits in the mathematical framework. Which property is failing there? Because that seems to me like a model that would satisfy loads of things.
So I think that actually also violates general systematicity for the exact same reason that we discussed before, because even though you include all the probability functions, still all probability functions will assign 1 to the tautology. So on the one hand, because the formal function you have in the background that says, well, that would tell me how to determine the probability or the expectation that the group assigns to any random variable. And then the thought is, well, what if the thing that we're aggregating is just the opinions that the group members assign to the tautology? Well, in that case, the formal function would just should output the singleton 1, because even if you have all possible probability functions as sort of the outputs of your pooling operator, still all probability functions would assign probability 1 to the tautology. So on the one hand, when you think about what the function should output when fed with a sequence of 1, on the one hand, it should give you one singleton containing 1, but on the other hand, you can just change the sequence of 1, change the interpretation of the sequence of 1 to be the expectation that the group members assign to some random variable, and in which case, because you have all possible probability functions in your domain, plausibly it should just dilate to 0 and 1. So you have two conflicting demands on the formal function you need to satisfy general systematicity. On the one hand, given the sequence of 1, you have to output 1. On the other hand, given the sequence of 1, it should be the interval between 0 and 1, or something even more than that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Miriam?
Oh, thanks. Super interesting. So I was just interested in the stuff you were saying at the very end about compromise versus, what was it, consensus or?
Consensus, yeah.
Compromise versus consensus. So I feel like, when you move to the imprecise thing, I mean, this is maybe related to some of the stuff people were just saying, things become very unconstrained in a certain way. So as far as the compromise point, do you see there being some specific benefit in moving to the imprecise way? Like, is that going to help us figure out which bets to take, as opposed to violating one of the constraints, say, for example, in the precise way?
Good, yeah. The short answer is no. I don't know whether or not there are any benefits. I think basically the consensus versus compromise distinction is supposed to be a reply to the triviality objection to moving to the imprecise framework. And then the thought is, well, actually, if you're interested in the problem of finding a compromise, then maybe the triviality objection stands. But then if you are interested in finding a constant consensus, then maybe this would give you a nice representation of the opinion of the group, especially if you think all the other axiomatic constraints are appropriate. So I do think that actually for compromise, I'm not sure. I just don't know whether or not imprecise probability would give us any option, especially because we're interested in decision making. So another way to think about the problem of compromise when we move to this imprecise framework is that before we're just using the probability for decision, the output of the aggregation for the decision making. But now it seems like the pooling operator is where we're trying to divide the problem into two parts. One is to find a representation, and the other one is to find a decision for the group. So the compromise would then, I think the compromise problem is really concerned about the second stage, which is not, you might think, well, according to this response, it's not answered by the aggregation function.
Got it. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Sorry. Cool. So I had first a clarification question about dictatorship. So when you were thinking about this kind of evidential version of linear pooling, this evidential version of pooling, right, where like the pooling function can depend on the evidence. Was the non-dictatorship condition there that there couldn't be any evidential input where the pooling function that you would get would be a dictatorship, or is it just that there needs to be some pieces of evidence that you could get where it won't be dictatorial?
Yeah, so actually I didn't define non-dictatorship in the case where you relativize the pooling rule to different evidence, and I think both are possible. The problem is that it's the choice doesn't matter because of the collapse result. So either way, because of the collapse result, when you're relativizing, you're actually not doing much. apart from the trivial evidence, all the pooling rules would be the same. So the two notions of dictatorship or non-dictatorship would actually coincide with each other.
Okay,
And so,
cool.
yeah.
Yeah, I see that. Okay. And then so I also wanted to ask about, so when you were talking about anonymity, so I'm wondering like what we think about like the motivation for anonymity, right? Because you might think, well, okay, so you know that all of these people are experts, but you still might nonetheless think some people are more expert than others.
Yeah.
And then, right, it's not obvious, right, that everyone, if you sort of permute like their probability assignments, should, that should result in the same thing. And I'm also wondering, like, you sort of might also think that it depends on the purpose, like maybe if your idea is to sort of represent consensus versus compromise, like in particular, if you are making some kind of compromise, it might, I don't know, I have the intuition it seems especially important to like kind of like weight the opinions that you sort of expect to be more expert or something.
Yeah.
Whereas like maybe if it's consensus, like, I don't know, it's like some weaker thing of you do want everything to be kind of represented flatly. I'm not exactly sure, but yeah, if you could say some more about that.
Yeah, good. So one quick thing to say, which I didn't say at all in the talk, is how this distinction between consensus and compromise. So I introduced this distinction in the context of solving the problem of pooling. But then one question you can ask is how that distinction relates to the problem of updating. So you might think actually when we're consulting the experts, we're really trying to solve the problem of compromise, because at least we want to know what we should do. Should we take another booster shot or should we not? So I think in that case, the solution to how the distinction relates to the problem of updating becomes a little bit tricky. On the other hand, you might think, well, actually, we're not so much interested in making a decision. Rather, we're really trying to find, for example, the starting point. For example, when Winkler was stating the quote, he was saying, well, really, we're interested in the problem of aggregation of priors. The thought is, well, we don't know which prior we should start with. So let's consult a bunch of experts. They give us their priors, and then we use that aggregate opinion as the starting point for an inquiry. So in that case, you might think, well, in that case, we are solving the problem of consensus, and maybe imprecise probability could be a rational response. I don't know. So I think that's sort of just lend support to the very elusive and maybe obvious point that the moving to the imprecise framework just sheds light and also helps us sharpen the focus of the target of judgment aggregation and also resolution of disagreement. Sorry, I forgot the first part of your question.
It was just about like the motivation for anonymity.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I think they're related. So one thing that's I think this is why the imprecise framework is very illuminating, because I think, yes, I think there are situations where, especially when we're trying to solve the problem of updating, it's reasonable to drop unanimity and then anonymity. And then a natural question to ask is what kind of principles you get, or what other constraints you get for identifying a set of pooling rules. I just don't know. I think, yeah, you're totally right. And I don't know the answer to that. And I think it's worth investigating. Yeah.
Cool, thanks. This is super cool.
Teddy, I think we'd be interested in hearing a bit more about your comments in the chat.
Yes, Snow, thank you very much for a very stimulating presentation. I'd like to engage you on a discussion about the adequacy of the consensus, of the convexity condition in consensus. And for this, I'm just going to point to one of several very old objections to based on the consequences for consensus. It has to do with a reinterpretation or a simple application of the failure of the external Bayesianity for the linear opinion pool. So here's the simple case. I'll try and be very brief. Suppose we have just two experts. The question before us is about, they're medical experts. And the question is about some therapy regarding a patient, and it's a binary question. If the patient has property M, then you treatment 1, not M, treatment 2. They both agree on this. And they also agree that there are some other features that you can report about the patient, which they agree are medically irrelevant. And this is to be understood as to say that each of them says that the probabilistic distribution of the medical condition and the other factor are probabilistically independent. Now, they disagree on both judgments, but they do agree that the independence is part of medical expertise. Anyone who would say that these factors are medically related is incompetent medically. We can fill in details. The problem now is when you convexify you have 2 points now, and you convexify, it's a simple three-dimensional space, a tetrahedron. There are 4 atoms, M, and two binary factors, a 2x2 table. You convexify the only points in the convex space which sit on the surface of independence between the 2 factors are the original opinions. Every other point you get by convexifying will live on one side of the surface of independence, which will either make the 2 factors positively relevant or negatively relevant. And once they're, say, positively relevant or negatively relevant, we're into the debate we had before lunch about the value of information, because under any such distribution that makes the 2 factors relevant, it's worth something to explore the irrelevant factor in order to make your decision about the relevant factor. Both experts, I think, would be opposed strongly to any consensus model that endorsed spending money as a diagnostic on the irrelevant factor in order to learn about the relevant one. So you're building in this convexity, which has this feature, I'm sorry for going on so long, this old feature about inadequacy of value of information in the consensus model. Do you not judge that to be an objection, a serious objection to the adequacy of convexity for a consensus model, in that it destroys unanimities about values of information amongst the experts?
Good, thank you. I mean, I will just plead ignorance. I really haven't thought deeply about the convexity issue. So the reason why I invoked convexity is really, so I was interested in the sort of the technical question, what conditions entail convex IP pooling, which is the rule that Stewart and Cortina introduced. And I was like, okay, how should I rule out the amalgamation, which does say that, well, the opinion of the group is just a set of the opinions of its individual members, rather than convexifying the set to get which is the recommendation of the convex IP pooling. The only way I know to do that, technically speaking, not on any philosophically well-motivated ground, is to introduce the convexity assumption. So I really don't know, I'm not wedded to that assumption in particular. And one thing that your comment made me think, and maybe you already know the answer to this question, which is whether if we build into this other assumption, for example, ruling out different independence judgments, so probability distributions that might be in the convex hall, but didn't share the unanimous independence judgments by the experts. If we build into that assumption, I would wonder, the natural question is whether or not that would just give us the amalgamation in the imprecise setting. Do you know the answer to that? Or?
So I did this in 2000 with Mark and Jay in 2008 when we introduced choice functions, and used as an example the ability to have as the using this value of information, the theme that Jasper was rehearsing, as a criteria for giving back exactly the points on the surface of independence. So yes, you can use the value of information the way I was just describing for you for picking up exactly the distributions that preserve independence. And if those are where the experts are, you don't want to destroy that unanimity.
Yeah. So I think that just suggests a sort of, yeah, I'm totally agree with you. And I think that might be an objection to the convex IP pooling rule as a way of aggregating the experts' opinions. In particular, you might think it destroys unanimity in another sense, unanimous consensus in another sense. And maybe that gives us some kind of triviality result. Well, depending on what's your attitude towards this result, you might think in the end, all we get is that the opinions of the group is a list of opinions of its individual members, which in one sense is trivial aggregation. In the other sense, it might also be illuminating in another way. But thank you, yeah. And I just haven't thought much about this.
Can I ask a follow-up on this, Teddy? Because I've always wanted to know more about this point. So I could end up making an independence judgment as one of these experts because I think like, well, true, learning that Kevin has a particular gene, I wouldn't pay to learn that in order to figure out what treatment to give him. But that's because I would need to know more information about Kevin. So if he has this gene and this other gene, then that's really highly relevant one way. And if he's got this gene and lacks this other gene, that's highly relevant in the other direction. I happen to not know whether he's got this other factor. And it's only because I kind of have this uncertainty about that other factor that I end up sort of thinking, on balance, it's not worth it for me to learn about whether he's got this gene or not. But if that's the case, I mean, I agree, like if I thought it was causally irrelevant, then that's something we should preserve. If we were all certain it was causally irrelevant, but you can end up having it factorized without making that judgment of causal irrelevance. And in that kind of case, I'm not sure why we need to preserve those independence judgments. So, but I'm sure you've thought a lot about this.
So I'll just quickly respond. I qualified by saying that the experts agree that it was a medical factor. You might want to call it a causal factor. Sure, that okay. No competent physician would model these as having any medical relevance. The one question to the other. That doesn't rule out situations where I think it's independent one way, you think it's independent, and you think it's independent, but we agree that there's a reasonable position in between which has them dependent. But I was already qualifying this by saying that we can take the condition of independence as part of the substantive assumption of the discipline. And in those cases, we want to distinguish those cases and preserve the independence when the experts say yes. Anyone who says to go do that is a sham physician.
Yeah, good. I think Jasper wants to jump in.
Yeah, when you talked about pooling imprecise experts into one imprecise opinion, sorry. You kind of suggested that we might consider one imprecise expert to be equivalent to a whole bunch of precise experts, and then we can just kind of like pool this infinity of precise experts. So by doing that, you seem to be implicitly kind of assuming that an imprecise model is kind of a set of candidate precise models. And okay, and then I see how it makes sense what you did there. I was wondering, is there any literature, or have you thought about if you don't do that? If one imprecise model is not deemed to be kind of like a set of candidates, but if you, I don't know, only work with its lower expectation, you have all these kind of different ways of looking at it. Any way you like, that's not bad. Have you thought about how that kind of changes this picture that you're painting here?
Good. So the short answer is, based on what I know from the literature, the problem is hard, and I don't think that there's a solution, though people have studied in aggregation of imprecise probabilities. And so I would again plead ignorance and saying like, I don't know what is the most recent model for that. And I was thinking for myself, I was playing around with the ideas that basically you can think of before we are aggregating probability functions, and well, assuming complexity or something like that, you might think, well, here is a natural way of thinking about how to aggregate imprecise probabilities. We're just aggregating lower coherent previsions. And then the thought is, we can just generalize the notion of general systematicity, so on and so forth, to lower coherent previsions as well, and what kind of characterization result we can get. I just didn't make much progress on that front. That's why I moved to this alternative model of thinking of each individual, which is, as you pointed out, is a very controversial assumption. I'm sort of splitting this individual up into sort of sub things, and then trying to say, okay, they're all experts, and I lose the boundary between individuals in a way when I was doing this pooling. So yeah, the short answer is I don't know, and I know people have been working on that, and I plan to look more. But yeah.
I think we're at the end of the queue. I have another question, but I'd be happy to answer.
I've just been thinking about a case where it feels like maybe the convex imprecise pooling doesn't seem appropriate or gets the wrong result. So I'm thinking of a case where you've got, say, 100 experts and 99 of them have, probability 0.9 in some proposition, and one guy has probability 0.1. And there's two things that you might want to say about this. One thing you might want to say is, I don't think the probability should go all the way down to 0.1. Maybe it should, you should get rid of some of that because it's just one guy, and you've got this kind of, they're all clustering up here. And the other thing you might want to say is, hey, look, we've got 99 people who are all, pretty confident about the thing. Maybe we should go above the upper end of their scale, and go beyond what would be sort of required by sort of Pareto thing, right? So A, do people share those intuitions? And B, if you want to accommodate a case where that kind of aggregation happens, where you don't take the whole of the convex hull and you take something outside of the convex hull as well in this kind of circumstance, what's going to have to change? What are you going to have to get rid of in the from your characterization result?
So let me answer the second question first, which is if you want to go beyond the convex hull, you have to drop general systematicity.
Right.
That entails that the output of the pooling operator is a subset of the convex hull. So you have to get rid of general systematicity. And also intuitively, I feel that might also be the thing that is contradicting your intuition, which I do recognize that is an intuitive thing to say. Namely, in this current model, convex imprecise pooling, it basically tells you that number doesn't matter. As long as you have one person who has this extreme opinion, it immediately widens the scope of possible permissible opinions. So probably general systematicity and maybe anonymity, going back to Kevin's point, both play a role in generating this kind of results. The thought is, well, the opinion of each group member matters and matters equally. And also somehow we want this way of putting us being formal in a particular way. So I think, though exactly how general systematicity is supposed to contradict your intuition is something that I have to think more about. Another quick thought is, you might think that also suggests that sort of just by representing the group, the opinion of the group as a set of probability distributions, maybe a two-course representation, because somehow you also want to represent, almost like you want to represent it as a probability distribution of probability distributions or something like that. The thought is, it's not merely just a list. Somehow I have to give more weight to some probability distributions in the representer of the group's overall opinion, and some less weight to some others, just representing how many people holding on to that opinion, something like that. So that might also
need to go all the way to some sort of probability distribution. You could just have like a multi-set or something, right?
A multi-set, yeah, that would also be a solution. Yeah, good. So yeah, anyway, that just shows that no, I don't know the answer again, but I think that's an interesting question to explore.
Thanks.
And that's exactly what Tetlock's group does, right? The secret broadcasting stuff, they extremize. But that is sort of trying to improve on the compromise in virtue of systematic tendencies to be underconfident or something like that.
That seems like a different phenomenon.
Yeah. Okay, well, that brings us to time. So let's thank Snow for an excellent talk.